Sup DS3TV, we are back for another video. This one is Sophie from Mars, interpreting superheroes as monsters, monster men. This one should be amazing, as all of her videos are. I mean, all of their videos are. And, yeah, let's get into it. And, yeah, gonna start playing in 2, 1.
Welcome to my ongoing series Monster Men, where we talk about why we tell monster stories and what they mean. Last time we talked about serial killer fiction, which is a pretty dark topic. It's pretty heavy. I actually had several friends drop out of collaborating on that video because of how grim the subject matter is, and I don't blame them. That's fair. But today we're going to talk about a much more light-hearted topic, superheroes. See, my contention is that superhero stories are a kind of monster story where the monster is on your side. With that all said, let's have a much more chill, relaxed time. Let's look at a much more easy topic.
Batman? Yeah, I think he's A-OK. He's kicking just the right butts. Butts the cops ain't kicking, that's for sure. Hope he goes after the homos next.
Wow, nice. I love this like intro into it. It's like I feel like I'm going into watching like a scary TV show from my childhood or something. Like it's an amazing intro.
Something we need to understand in talking about the history of comic books is the influence of the Comics Code Authority. From 1954 to about the year 2000, the CCA, a conservative censorship organization, was giving their stamp of approval to comic books they considered morally appropriate. While not as direct as something like, say, the Hollywood blacklist, it did guide where the bulk of advertising money was spent, and so it indirectly controlled what comics got to get published for decades. Their conservative censorship prohibited mainstream comics from featuring excessive violence, sexuality, anything too politically challenging, and of course, any representation or acknowledgement of the existence of queer people whatsoever.
The Comics Code Authority was started in large part as a response to the publication of Frederick Wordham's book, The Seduction of the Innocent, in which Frederick is a big crying baby. Sorry, I can't talk about this guy with a straight face. He claimed Wonder Woman was a lesbian, which, okay? He's also the originator...
Like, what's the problem with that? I don't... Okay.
...of the lazy homophobic tropes about Batman and Robin being gay together.
Because he was such a normal, regular dude, so secure in his masculinity and his sexuality that he couldn't...
Yes, because he's a big man and he knows that. And he knows that he can see when people are different from himself. Yes, he is so confident. This man who is telling everybody else what they are is so confident in himself.
See a man and a boy living together, having a close relationship, like, I don't know, father and son, without blowing his no-homo whistle and calling the gay police.
In response to his gay-bashing fear-mongering, comics publishers established the CCA, which then controlled the comics mainstream for almost half a century. So as you can imagine, an underground community of comics celebrating diversity, queerness, and communism. I'm just kidding. There were people making fantastic comics really challenging the status quo, but the main thing that the comic book fans felt missing was violence and gore. Titles like Judge Dredd, Grendel, Hellboy were drawing a ton of attention away from big publishers abiding by the CCA, and ultimately when advertisers saw there was a market for those comics, they started ignoring the CCA's recommendation, and by 2000 the stamp of approval was largely ignored, with Marvel fully abandoning it in 2001 and DC finally abandoning it in 2011. And since then, comics have been as gory and violent as anyone could have ever wished for.
Nice. I love this. This is for me.
Yay! The history is important to understand because this censorship of extreme violence and the appetite it spawned is the context into which Frank Miller published The Dark Knight Returns.
Important note, I realize that what I wrote here might sound extreme to some people, so in the following section, I call Frank Miller a fascist a bunch of times, because he is one.
The book begins with a piece by Jimmy Olsen bemoaning how bad everything has become now that the real good people have gotten too old or retired or they've become too broken to carry on, and how things used to be good. He ends the article, "We used to have heroes." Bruce Wayne has been retired as Batman for a decade, and in his absence Gotham City has fallen apart, with street gangs maintaining an absolute reign of terror and sensitive liberals who are doing nothing, or in some cases, like the treatment of the criminally insane psychos at Arkham Asylum, are actually making the situation worse. At the peak of the crime wave, Batman finally returns to crack down on crime, defeating the leader of the biggest gang, putting an end to the Joker once and for all, co-opting the gang goons to form his own gang dedicated to maintaining law and order on the streets of Gotham. Eventually, Superman is called in to stop Batman's vigilante push against degeneracy engulfing Gotham, and Batman has to fake his death so he and his gang can continue to maintain order from the shadows.
And when I first read this comic as a teenager, I thought it was satirizing the beliefs I now realize it's sincerely promoting, because this book is extremely fascist. Miller constructs Batman as a noble crusader against societal decay and criminal degeneracy. He plays to the reactionary fear of inner-city crime by portraying Gotham as almost completely succumbed to gangs and muggings and murders and prostitution. He shows out-of-touch liberal elites who have convoluted theories for how to help, but really just make the problem worse, where ordinary people support the good old-fashioned common sense approach of getting out on the streets and cracking heads. He shows people calling Batman a fascist at several points in the comic, but it's only there to show how out of touch those people are and how much they don't have the courage to do what really needs to be done.
Jim Gordon shoots a teenager to death at point blank, and the internal monologue we get is, "I think of Sarah. The rest is easy." Batman starts a street gang dedicated to law and order. Like, come on. The same kids are shown earlier in the story joining a neo-Nazi gang. How is this not satire? Because of the history I already outlined, of course, The Dark Knight Returns was enormously popular when it came out, and has become one of the most influential graphic novels ever written.
So, Batman's a fascist now!
The Dark Knight Trilogy by Christopher Nolan and Batman v Superman by Zack Snyder both borrow heavily directly from The Dark Knight Returns, and in a more general sense, Batman has led the charge in mainstream superheroes becoming edgier.
Everyone talking about influential comic books talks about The Dark Knight Returns like it's the same as Watchmen or V for Vendetta. I think they're confusing popularity for some other quality. Like, they talk about the death of Superman the same way. A comic book where Superman gets punched really hard and dies was always going to sell well. That doesn't mean it has anything to say.
Watchmen and The Dark Knight Returns were actually released by the same company in the same year. This is the degree to which publishers and fans alike don't really seem to discern between comics. Alan Moore's Watchmen tells us, if superheroes existed in the real world, they'd be kind of fascist, and that would suck. While Miller's Dark Knight Returns tells us, if Batman existed in the real world, he'd be a fascist, which would be really cool.
Rather than anyone in Watchmen, Frank Miller's Batman is most directly comparable to V from Alan Moore's V for Vendetta. V is a terrorist, but he's like a cool terrorist.
Yeah, you probably should not say that. You know, that's just something you probably shouldn't say, just out of, just out of curiosity. You probably shouldn't say it, but hey.
Depictions of terrorism are definitely also a kind of monster story, but it's really complicated and will need its own episode, so we're not going to get into it here. V is a terrorist against an authoritarian regime directly trying to topple the white supremacist Christo-fascist government, but it's the deliberate obfuscation of Batman's politics by Frank Miller that makes him so fashy. Miller's heroes commit acts that are clearly terrorism, but for them the enemy isn't the state or the political establishment, but rather the culture. The government is seen as part of the problem, but who Batman targets directly is the young people, the gangs, the vibrant and often queer and racially coded counterculture. Hope he goes after the homos next. To examine this rhetorical trick, we need to accept that Frank Miller isn't simply using this guy as an authorial mouthpiece. He's doing something altogether more slimy, First he shows us the working class black man, and we, the reader, agree that Batman is doing a good job in making up for the lacking law enforcement. But then, we, as an audience, with a presumed set of liberal values and sensibilities, are told that this guy is a violent homophobe. Oh no! Maybe Batman is bad after all, and the people who call him a fascist are correct. But then, we see the prime example of the person who calls him a fascist. The white liberal elite who drawls on with long-winded jargon, only to admit when confronted that no, he'd never actually live in Gotham City. So our reality must lie somewhere in the middle, right? But that's just it. In this Batman comic for Batman fans, there isn't really much telling us that we should find our answer between these two guys. One of them likes Batman, the other doesn't. One of them is the relatable everyman, the other is the despicable liberal. What we functionally have here is a two-panel argument that while you might not agree with violent bigots, they're the ones who are really on your side. The 30th anniversary edition of Dark Knight Returns has a preface where Miller talks to Brian Azzarello, his co-writer on one of the sequels. And what really stands out is, well...
God, I can't tell you how much I actually really want to get a book. Like, again, like, I really just want to, like, hold a book and, like, read through. Because I haven't hit a book, like, that I've wanted to read through in about in a while now. So, yeah, I really just want to hold on to a book and, like, feel the pages like that I turn and stuff like that.
How much of a reactionary turd Miller is making Bruce Wayne into?
My intention in the beginning was to tell a story of Batman at the age he would be at this time if he really aged from his origins. He was aged, he was seeing how the world had changed, and how he would bring essentially a World War II mentality to the modern world. To him, it wasn't just criminals he was fighting anymore. It was moral decay and political corruption.
It's important to appreciate that a writer constructs a narrative to show us who is right and who is wrong. And nothing that happens in this story...
I feel like when somebody's writing, though, I feel like it's more so I get to see a peek into their soul. And what I mean by that is, like, I get to, like, usually when you're writing something, I get to see especially what you want. Like, I get to see exactly what you want me to see at that time. Like, you know, like, how do you feel about these certain situations from your heart? Like, literally, I'm seeing your soul. That's how I feel when I'm reading what somebody wrote.
Really tells us Batman is wrong. He gets results, he beats the gang leader, he kills the Joker, he saves Gotham. Again and again, smug liberals with their sensitive psychological therapeutic approach to solving problems fall short, and Batman's straightforward muscle punchman approach saves the day. Everything is a contest of brutality, strength, and cruelty, and Batman saves Gotham by being the most brutal, the strongest, and the cruelest. Something that really comes through in that preface is how much Miller was projecting not only a disgust towards liberals and progressives, but a disgust towards weakness he saw in himself.
But you realize that that's, like, I don't understand that, because, like, Batman is known for being methodical and, like, he doesn't have to use violence, like, he does sometimes, and a lot of times he can, but, like, he also can be a detective. Like, he's not just, like, basically just all brawn with no, like, brains. He has brains, too.
On the topic of aging Batman up, he says,
I was 29 years old. I was dreading turning 30. To me, that was entering middle age.
There's a really tangible envy that's typical of reactionaries, of the people who got to fight in a so-called meaningful war, where Miller feels like he's turning 30 and turning soft. He writes this Batman who brings in a World War II mentality.
I'm not saying all of this to try and do what Frederick Wertham or the CCA did. I'm not trying to blacklist The Dark Knight Returns or say anyone's bad for liking it, but it's important to understand all of this to understand why our current ways of telling superhero stories are the way they are, and why so many of them focus on the authoritarian mindset of the vigilante. Besides which, Frank Miller didn't invent fascist Batman from whole cloth. The potential for this kind of superhero storytelling has been there right from the start.
Implicitly, the idea of the superhero ties into the great man theory of history, with powerful individuals' decisions being the only important things that move the plot of history forwards. In a piece for The Guardian on the strange cultural position of superhero stories, Archie Bland wrote,
"Some connect the concept of the superhero back to Nietzsche's 1883 work of philosophy, Thus Spoke Zarathustra, with its idea of the Übermensch, a superior human whose existence would justify the species. The word itself was first used in 1917 to describe a public figure of great accomplishments."
The original superhero, Superman, was first conceived as a bitter and angry homeless man who, suddenly gifted with superpowers, took out his vengeance upon society. When the series became an ongoing story, Jerry Siegel decided a hero would sell better, so when I say superheroes are monsters who are on our side, it's really been there since the start. In his book Popular Culture, Geopolitics and Identity, political geographer Jason Dittmer explains that
Captain America predates the American entry into World War II, but he nevertheless punches Adolf Hitler in the face on the cover of Captain America Comics #1. This was because the early comic book industry was dominated by Jewish artists and writers who were far more aware of Hitler's treatment of European Jews than most Americans.
Well, and that's why I say that's exactly why I was saying earlier, you get a viewpoint into whoever written it and the artist's soul. Like you do. Just because basically they're gonna pour out what they feel like the content should be. And especially if they're given their own free, creative writing, yeah, that's just how it's gonna be.
Were. Hoping to push America off the bench and into the fight, Joe Simon and Jack Kirby created Captain America and located him in an America that was rife with German spies and subversives.
Captain America's origin, jingoistic as it may be, was driven by really good intentions. But here's the rub. A monster antagonist necessitates conflict. The protagonists have to do something to try and stop them. But a monster protagonist needs to be given things to do. And that's why after World War II ended, Captain America fell massively out of popularity. Marvel actually tried to reboot the hero twice and failed. Once in a horror series and then again as Captain America Commie Smasher. Both series failed to sell and had to be scrapped quickly. For example, when DC wanted to compete with Marvel, who already had a black superhero, Luke Cage, they created the Black Bomber, a white racist who would turn into a black superhero under stress. Don Markstein, a comics historian, would later describe this as an insult to practically anybody with any point of view at all. Sorry, I just love reading that quote. This character would later be scrapped by DC, who then hired Tony Isabella, a writer with experience on Luke Cage, who created the character of Black Lightning.
the superheroes of DC Comics tend to try and remain more abstract and philosophical with concepts like, what if a guy was really strong? Or what if a rich guy solved crimes, rather than Marvel's arms-dealing billionaire privatizes hyper-technological policing, or angry frisbee patriot. And as such, Marvel's blunders are a lot more explicit and politically involved. Dittmer writes,
Places can be represented in a variety of ways, some subtle and some blatant. Captain America decidedly falls into the blatant category. Given his origin as a jingoistic wartime crusader against Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan, this should not be too surprising.
in the 60s and 70s, when Captain America was successfully rebooted, he came back as a social justice warrior, but no more of a radical than before.
With communism unavailable for Captain America to battle, he instead continued his rivalry with, of all people, Nazis, such as the Red Skull and the Prussian aristocrats Baron Zemo and Strucker. While this seems bizarre, given the lack of real-world threat posed by Nazis in the 1960s, it makes sense if you consider the ideological value of Nazis as still to this day being seen as inimical to the mythological values of America as home to individual freedom and equality.
So embarrassed by their attempts at red baiting, Marvel actually retconned Captain America's history to claim that Steve Rogers had been trapped in an iceberg since 1945, making a distinction between the real Captain America and the 1950s McCarthyite Cap, who was revealed to be an imposter. Someone who was a fan of the original Captain America, who had blackmailed the US government into letting him be the new Cap, and then spent his time chasing down communist sympathizers. and people of colour.
In the 70s, there were a couple of arcs featuring this 50s Cap, where he comes back spouting racist nonsense and working with the KKK, trying to start a race war, and the good, sensible, centrist, liberal Captain America has to stop him.
What's interesting about the storytelling element is that the writers of Captain America essentially turned their mistakes into a monster, literally creating a bad Captain America, all the while refusing to question the character of the real Cap. This examination of this monster, the owning up to the fact that some element within America had always been this way, and furthermore that that element was inspired by the character they continued to promote, ironically drew attention away from America's favourite monster. The monster who fights for us, battling his reflection who fights for them.
The monster of the superhero needs to be put to use, and finding a justification of that is one of the elements of superhero stories that lends itself naturally to reaction. Most superheroes are crime fighters, so to continually justify their existence, these heroes keep being tied back to policing. Miller's bleak, violent, street gang-dominated Gotham was building on this existing element, and on the urban crime wave that was a huge focus of conservative politics in the 70s and 80s. In the preface to Dark Knight Returns, Miller says,
"Crime was rampant, and I had been mugged a few times. I would be very, very angry just watching Clint Eastwood movies back to back."
But it's always kind of, I feel like when it comes to like that stuff too, you know, because people do say crime is rampant. If it happened to you, usually it could have been people that grew up in that same exact neighborhood or a neighborhood that actually was considered bad. But if nothing happened to them, they're going to say like, oh yeah, the neighborhood isn't bad. It's pretty good. It's a pretty good neighborhood. Like, you know, nothing happened to me. So like, you know, it's a survivor bias that like everything is good. But like also if something bad happened to you, like everything is bad. Like this whole place is bad. Like it just can't be ever good. Like, you know, somebody needs to do something about this or something. So it's always like that too. You know, I just thought to bring that up.
Just getting absolutely paranoid. I figured if Batman was a grown-up, he'd take care of things.
this is another place where the monster who fights for us is making superhero fans uneasy. As more people rightly start to question the police, more people are uncomfortable with superheroes being magical cops.
So the natural question now is what alternatives there are to the super cop. One possibility, considering the superhero monster has always been a defender of the status quo, is to keep superheroes as the protagonist, but instead make them represent the marginalized and the oppressed instead of the powerful.
Well, it's also something that Stan Lee, the absolute mad lad, thought of decades ago. Lee always tried to write superheroes who had everyday, relatable problems, saying,
I have always included minority characters in my stories, often as heroes. We live in a diverse society, in fact, a diverse world, and we must learn to live in peace and with respect for each other.
That is true. If you think about it, like, relatable things like, actually, Spider-Man's story is probably pretty relatable to people in New York. Like, or anybody that grew up in a bad neighborhood. And maybe that situation could have happened. Like, that's a normal situation that your uncle could have been shot. Like, that's a normal situation. But, considering the crime. So, that could be a normal situation, just like how Bruce Wayne's parents got shot. Maybe in different circumstances, but it could happen. But those, it's relatable to our audience because, yes, they went through grief too. So yeah, it makes sense to make it that much more relatable,
And
let's lay it right on the line. Bigotry and racism are among the deadliest social ills plaguing the world today. But unlike a team of costume supervillains, they can't be halted with a punch in the snoot or a zap from a ray gun. Excelsior, true believers. It's me, Smilin' Stan.
And so it's no surprise that Stan Lee would create a whole team of superheroes whose troubled lives come from their diversity and from what makes them different.
The X-Men, if you don't know what the X-Men are, what am I doing? The mutants in the X-Men are an in-universe, marginalized group, and because of that they serve as a really robust metaphor for lots of real-world groups.
In Pop Culture, Geopolitics and Identity, Dittmer has this to say about the X-Men.
Some readers saw the story as an allegory for American...
I was just talking about X-Men earlier, and like Nightcrawler's my favorite. My favorite from X-Men, actually, from the X-Men universe.
race relations, with Professor X standing in for Martin Luther King and Magneto standing in for the more controversial Malcolm X. This reading makes special sense in the comic book, which was first published in 1963.
Dittmer goes on to say,
However, to many audiences, the franchise's tales of an oppressed genetic minority has equally often seemed to be that of homosexuals, especially in X2. In that film, the plot remains focused on ethnic conflict, but there is a scene in which mutant Bobby Drake comes out of the closet to his parents by demonstrating his power to them. His mother's response, "Have you tried not being a mutant?" is something of an in-joke with homosexual viewers as the cliched response of many parents of homosexuals. The third film, X-Men: The Last Stand, is driven by a medical cure for mutanthood, intersecting with political debates in the United States about homosexual marriage and whether or not homosexuality is a choice or a genetic trait.
in this regard, X-Men and other superhero stories like it bring superheroes into the real world in a different way altogether, making them not idols or gods of myth, but relatable human beings. In X-Men, the persistent plight of
I think
Mystique
it said Nightcrawler's Night Stalker. Sorry about that.
highlights the intersectional nature of oppression, since her struggle is markedly worse than the rest of the mutants. Cyclops or Wolverine can pass as non-mutants in public, but Mystique has to disguise herself to avoid inspiring fear and hatred from others.
In this sense, Mystique could be understood in the queer reading of X-Men to be a trans woman, or a black woman in the civil rights allegory, but for that matter just also someone with significantly darker skin. Her story intuitively explains the way that some people in marginalized groups face more severe or complicated forms of bigotry, and that's why many representations of her character show her sympathetic to the protagonist's cause, but ultimately rejecting their moderate politics because she knows that only Magneto and the Brotherhood of Mutants can bring about the change that will make her safe. But you know who else has thoughts about the progressive and diverse messaging of the X-Men? Frank Miller! Fuck this guy.
The actual primary antagonists of The Dark Knight Returns are the Mutant Gang. They're a group of colourful young people who wear these visor glasses, and they're a stand-in for everything wrong with society, the degeneration of Gotham City. The stated mission of this series...
But I don't even understand the degeneration. Gotham has always been a terrible place. It's always been, like, literally the worst place on Earth. So what do you mean the degradation of Gotham? Gotham has been the worst. You can't make something that's already the worst even worse. That's not true. Like, that doesn't make sense to me.
is to interrogate why we tell monster stories, and Frank Miller repeatedly relies on the image of the degenerate criminal as monster to justify the existence of the monster on our side, the superhero.
The leader of the mutant gang is a fanged and clawed, grotesque monster man who speaks in broken English, and actually, Frank, why does he speak like that?
The guy with the sharp teeth, Mr. T, was a real popular figure at the time. And
that's why yeah. I mean, of course you would be racist. That makes sense.
Patent his speech as close to Mr. T's as I could.
Oh, Pog. Maybe as a special lover of monsters, and as someone trying to find the human beings at the root of all these monster stories, I have a bit of a bias. But this is why I have a particular disdain for the cheap fascist crap that Frank Miller peddles. Maybe that's just me. Oh wait, no! Even his fans are sick of his bullshit now.
Holy Terror is a comic written by Frank Miller in direct response to 9/11, where not Batman and not Catwoman team up to fight Al-Qaeda.
I've followed Miller for many years. The art and one-liners are good as always. Miller, as always, goes to extremes to prove a point. Sadly, I'm not sure what the point is he's trying to make. Okay, I figured all the negative reviews were to the book offending the political correct bunch, as if they would order this book anyway. It's rubbish. Everything about it.
That's sad when people actually on here that are in your political party don't even see it as a good book. That is sad. That means you literally have made trash nothing. Because even if they're like, I thought the negative reviews were like from people from the other party, but nope, I didn't like it either. Like, that sounds bad.
The fact it's rubbish offended me. Hour of my life gone, zilch narrative, difficulty following artwork, and done in an hour. Trust me, don't bother. don't even borrow a copy.
As for Miller himself, when he was working on the book, he described his upcoming masterpiece as,
Not to put too fine a point on it, a piece of propaganda. Superman punched.
Welcome back, DS3 TV. We're back to watch the idiocy, the lunacy of this man Frank Miller and his fascist books. Let's keep going. And this was made in 2015, so that's what makes it even funnier to me.
Captain America. That's one of the things they're there for.
explaining his reaction to 9/11 as the inspiration for the book, he said,
For the first time in my life, I know how it feels to face an existential menace. They want us to die.
I mean, yeah, but also you don't know who funded that menace. The same country that you're probably loving right now. I'm just saying, like, that's not. It's not. It's not as one-sided as you're trying to make it seem. And yes, you've seen it on TV, but you didn't really go through anything if your no family members died from you. Like, I'm just saying, you didn't have to go through that much. Like, you went through probably just, yeah. It's sad that a lot of people died, yeah. But you didn't have it as bad as the people's families who actually had people dying in the towers.
All of a sudden, I realized what my parents were talking about all those years. Patriotism, I now believe, isn't some sentimental old conceit. It's self-preservation. I believe patriotism is central to a nation's survival.
While we're here, why don't we just take a moment to look at this drawing of, presumably, Obama?
Yes, and that is patriotism of your president, because, hey, even if you don't like the presidency, your presidency is still supposed to be happy. I don't care. You're just supposed to be happy that he's your president if you're a patriot, a true patriot, right? That's what that's supposed to mean. Because you just love your country no matter what, I guess, but that doesn't look like that. That just looks racist, but hey, you're not going to talk about it.
Give my regard to those 72 black-eyed virgins.
I'm so tired.
Holy Terror was going to star Batman, and Miller claims that at some point he realized this was no longer a Batman story. But the protagonist is very clearly Batman, his love interest is very clearly Catwoman, there's Jim Gordon, the city is obviously Gotham. It feels like DC pumped the brakes here.
I mean, I definitely just feel like that. I mean, this looks like a schizophrenic person's drawings, but like I can still tell what it is. It's just horribly drawn for a comic book, and it really is horribly drawn. Yeah, it looks terrible.
In 2006, when the book was still about Batman, Grant Morrison, fellow Batman writer, and also the most extra comic book writer yet born on planet Earth, explained why even they found it completely ridiculous.
Batman versus Al-Qaeda. Might as well be Bin Laden versus King Kong. But how about the sinister Al-Qaeda mastermind up against the hungry Hannibal Lecter? For all the good it's likely to do. Cheering on a fictional character as he beats up fictionalized terrorists seems like a decadent indulgence when real terrorists are killing real people in the real world. I'd be so much more impressed if Frank Miller gave up all this graphic novel nonsense, joined the army, and with a howl of undying hate rushed headlong onto the front lines with the young soldiers who are actually...
Yeah, that's how I feel about it, because I have friends that are actually in the military, so I don't really see Frank Miller doing anything to help anyone. He literally isn't doing anything. I want him to go to the front lines and actually do something. Like, you're not doing anything. You're just talking. You're literally just talking your head off. I hate when people do that, literally.
They're risking life and limb versus Al-Qaeda.
Kind of rude of them to come right to Frank Miller's house and get him where he fucking lives. Look, don't read this book. I had to, and that's already one person too many. Terrorism is a complex...
I feel bad for you. I really do. Like, Sophie, I feel bad. I feel bad for you. I'm hoping that you didn't have to read too much. I'm hoping that it didn't like stick with you. And hopefully that hopefully that the ad revenue that you get from these videos helped you.
subject that deserves to be handled with care and nuance and even a vague grasp of geopolitics, and that's why I'm giving it a whole episode later in this series. Don't read the angry, stabby racism book. Just go outside for an hour, sit by a tree. Much better.
This episode sponsored by trees.
Some more recent
Touch grass.
media embraced the idea that superheroes are a little bit fashy, just, not as the good guys. They even leaned into the idea that superheroes can be scary monsters. Amazon's The Boys is a great look at superheroes as metaphors for different ideological strains in the American ruling class. Okay, Season 1 is kind of dragged down by its edgy source material in my opinion. All I can say is, if you're halfway through Googling Holy Terror Frank Miller PDF right now, stop and Google Put Locker The Boys Season 2 instead. In Minecraft. Parody, non-actionable.
Here's my 2-point pitch for watching this excellent season of television. 1, the Nazis invented superheroes, because of course they did. 2, Captain America Superman standing on the top of a building, masturbating into the wind and yelling, "I can do anything I want." The Boys Season 2 is so fucking good. It's what Frank Miller wishes he could write, and it's even an interesting use of super terrorism. But we'll talk about that later. So now we've seen superheroes as the monster protagonist promoting authoritarianism, as the monster antagonist condemning it. We've seen how superheroes can be the sympathetic monster driven away by society, but before we wrap up, I want to talk about why. A lot of it rests on that idea that when the monster is there and they're on our side, they have to be given something to do. Look at what happens to Gotham when Batman retires. Really terrible. There is a pattern of people identifying with the supervillains. The Joker says society treats mentally ill people like garbage. Killmonger wants to turn the tables on historic colonial injustice.
Well, yeah, because he feels like that I'm going off of what Killmonger believes, that he feels like we can help everybody if we just give everybody what we have. But he's not realizing that also it's bad people that will do bad things with what you have. Well, what you can help the world with. It's not just it's not just good. I'll say it's not just good people. You know what I mean? Like, it's not just good people that would be happy with you giving them beneficial things. It's evil people that will just take it and then do evil things with that.
Magneto wants to keep his people safe, and he doesn't care who he hurts to do it because society hurts his people so much already, compounded even further in the movie franchise where Magneto is a Holocaust survivor. This is why we see people push radical politics by saying things like, not gay as in one of the X-Men, but queer as in Magneto was right. This too is where our problem of the superhero monster constantly needing something to fight against arises. If the superhero is a defender of the status quo, then his constant battle is against anyone who opposes it. But what if our superhero fought against the constant evil that thrives in the real world? In his video, How Were They Allowed to Make Immortal Hulk?, Scaredy Matt from Scaredy Cats asks the question, how were they allowed to make Immortal Hulk? It's a question worth asking because Immortal Hulk, for a Marvel series about a flagship character...
And we're back again. The battery died last time the SIM card went out. So not SIM card, but it went over the 30-minute mark, so we had to just keep, we had to take it out of the tape. But it's fine. We're here. This is it. We only have 8 minutes left of it, so let's get into it. And
is a shockingly radical comic. I'm talking about Bruce Banner explaining to the media how corporations exploit and profit off disasters. I'm talking about Hulk gaining a following of protesters who are basically Antifa. I'm talking about the central conceit of the series being Hulk smashes capitalism. The main antagonism currently in the series is Hulk taking on a huge multinational megacorporation called Roxxon. Roxxon are a staple for Marvel talking about capitalism. They're the corporation Miles Morales was defending from evil protesters in the new game.
Yeah, I do remember hearing about Roxxon. I didn't know where I heard Roxxon, but that makes a lot of sense, and that's kind of crazy, and that's their stand-in for capitalism.
And the CEO of Roxxon is a horrifying Minotaur man in this comic, who treats the world around him, his possessions, his staff, and the public alike as completely disposable. Oh, and of course, when his true form is revealed publicly, it doesn't even hurt the company's stock prices. Incidentally, the company manufacture and sell the plastic Hulk masks the protesters wear, which of course doesn't make the protests any less meaningful, or the company any less opposed to them. It's just a nice touch showing how businesses will profit off absolutely anything they can. In the same way that Captain America was there to push America into World War II, and in an era now when so many comic book writers still just make Donald Trump their symbol of everything wrong in the world, Immortal Hulk seemingly exists to explain to young comic book readers what all those protests on the news are about, why they're so mad, and yeah, they do a great fucking job. There's this whole bit where this cop is thinking about his kid who he no longer relates to, thinking about how he wanted this traditional, conservative American dream future for her, and the more she's become some dyed-hair, lefto-commie radical who he doesn't understand anymore, the more he sees her as part of the problem, up to the point where he's pointing his gun at her in the crowd, and he's imagining what will happen next, knowing he'll get away with it, facing no legal consequences. And he thinks about who he wanted her to be, and he pulls the trigger. It's a real, I think of Sarah moment.
And then the Hulk steps in the way of the bullet, and he... In Minecraft, parody, non-actionable. This comic is shockingly radical.
At their absolute best, superhero stories embrace the way that a superhero can be a monster, and the way that a monster is a representation of an idea, an abstraction of something bigger than a person. And when the comic book characters fight, you're seeing a clash of different ideologies, or seeing the way that issues interact with one another. Magneto versus Professor X, Avengers Civil War, Batman versus Superman. In the middle of Civil War 2, see, I can't make an Electric Boogaloo joke here because of the Boogaloo Boys. Goddamn fascists ruin everything. In the middle of Civil War 2, the Civil Warning, there's this great scene where Tony Stark is trying to get Miles Morales over to his side, and he explains the future crime prediction policing that he's opposed to as like racial profiling. And when you think he's just gonna get away with manipulating this teenage boy, Miles says, "Hey, why did you say that? You're making that comparison because of my race, right?" And Tony Stark has to own up to exactly what he just did. But also, Miles can see that it's a valid comparison that bears saying. In Immortal Hulk, there's a villain brought in by Roxxon, whose power is to change how people remember things. He retcons everything good that leftist commie Hulk ever did as something he did instead, and only lets people remember the bad things Hulk did. Liberal propaganda is a big fluffy monster villain in Immortal Hulk. They made Aaron Sorkin the villain of this comic book. The comparison deserves to be made here between Zemnu the fluffy propaganda monster and honestly, what Marvel have themselves done, pretending McCarthyite Captain America was an imposter, framing Magneto's separatism as dangerous, radical, short-sighted, and wrong. And what's great about Immortal Hulk is that both in the allegory and in the real world, the solution to this problem is to parody non-actionable.
The way that people are continually drawn to super villains because they challenge the status quo, the Joker, Magneto, Killmonger, is so beautifully expressed through the Hulk, and through the series' constant refrain, is he man, or is he monster, or is he both? Immortal Hulk is such a fantastic bit of monstrous superhero storytelling, because Bruce Banner's monstrous side is also just a thinking, feeling, reasoning person. And when you get down to it, what he really wants is actually pretty cool. And in another sense, the monster of Immortal Hulk is the monster that the media make him out to be in order to dismiss away his intentions and his agenda and deflect from criticisms of capital. But he gains popular support nonetheless, because even if he's a monster, people can see he's not the kind of monster that defends the status quo. He's the kind of monster that necessitates change. And that's what they want. I hope that more and more this is the kind of superhero story people are going to want, because if a monster is going to fight for us, the monster is going to have to fight for change. And it's going to have to be a monster who gets angry. A monster the establishment won't like when he's angry. Okay, we've talked about serial killers and we've talked about superheroes. People who are real, who do terrible things, fictional characters who are usually good. Next time we're going to need to get back to basics. and really dig in on a proper original monster. I hope you'll join me on the next Monster Men when we discuss vampires.
That sounds like it's gonna be very interesting. Yeah, sounds like it's gonna be very, very interesting. I'm ready to see it. But yeah, doing pretty good. So yeah, talk to you guys in the next video. What was I gonna say? Oh yeah, subscribe to the channel. Also, follow my Twitch. And link down in the description for my Twitch, and also link down in the description for the original video, and recommend me videos in the comment section down below that you want me to react to. Talk to you guys in the next video. Peace.